5 months and 3 months. No, obviously not the model numbers, but the time that I already have them here without having actually reviewed them. And the reason therefore is actually just as easy to explain as it is silly. I've never reviewed an integrated amp before. I mean, obviously I've used them before and I know the good and the bad stuff about it, but I never had to put that into actual words. And since I don't really know the viewership for these kind of reviews, I didn't quite know of how I should give you the information and what kind of information you want. But since I was in the market for one of these myself, I decided just to do one thing. I will answer you the questions that I would have had and maybe a little bit of some extra information which should help you to decide if you want to go into that. So the first question is, what are these actually and what kind of price range we are talking about? Now this is the Cambridge Audio CXA80, 80 watts, and it costs around $999. Now this is the Cambridge Audio Azur 851A, costs around $1,500 at least officially, but since this is already a little bit more of a dated version, it costs street price wise around $1,300. But the difference is actually even bigger if you equalize them in terms of features, because the CXA already has digital inputs, which since it's a little bit older, when it just wasn't quite the thing, the Azur comes only with analog ones. And if you want to add those with something, for example, with the Cambridge Audio DAC Magic 100, you have to add at least like $100, $150 more, and then the price difference is already closer to $500. But let me just tell you this, if you buy something like these amplifiers, you will have them for at least 5, 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, depending on how long you want to stay on this kind of level. And if you consider that $500, maybe though it even sounds quite a lot at first for the initial purchase, after 10 years, on a daily basis, if you just add this little bit of extra money, it might be worth it to go for the bigger one. At least that's the way I think by now, because all the past when I bought cheaper electronics, I used them for so long and I thought if I would have just paid a little bit more, it would have maybe been even worth it. Now, is there any competition at that price? I've actually checked the market beforehand and I didn't really find that many at around $1,000 to $1,500, because what I found from the brands that I trust and that I know that are usually good would be as a competitor the CXA80, the Yamaha S801, very similarly priced, also has DAC already and all the things like that. And in comparison to the Cambridge Audio Azur 851A, I found the Yamaha S1100. Price-wise also quite similar. So that's roughly of a ballpark. I can't really judge those because I didn't get the chance to review them. Yamaha just didn't get back to me. But before we are getting into this, let's start with the least important part in my opinion, at least for many people, it will be the remote control. So let's check these. Now on the left side we have the one for the CXA80. And here we have the one for the Azur. And obviously you can maybe already tell that this one just looks a little bit more premium, a little bit nicer with a finish, also kind of aluminum brush finish, even though it's pretty much just nice high quality plastic. And in this way we have the brushing on the other side. But this one is noticeably heavier and just feels a little bit more premium. Not that there's really anything wrong with that. Now in terms of buttons, the CXA has a nice click and nice tactile feedback, which we don't really get on the Azur one. And what I noticed here, if I press, for example, volume up and down a little bit just deeper than usually, it changes the level by actually 2 steps instead of just 1. That's something you have to get used to. And I'm actually not a big fan of these remote controls in general, for the one reason that we have so many buttons we in most cases won't use unless you maybe use already, for example, here the CX ecosystem from Cambridge Audio, because here we have the CXC, here we have the CXA, which is the right one, and CXN. But you will mostly use these buttons for the sources and maybe up and down for the volume. Even though I have to say in this case, I don't think it's all that smart to put the whole cursor in between volume up and down. So it's always a little bit of a stretch. It would be nice if that would be done just one flip switch. But it's not. But otherwise it's fine. Just not the biggest fan of the layout itself. It's a little bit better on the one of the Azur because we only have the play button in between, but this one just feels a little bit more spongy. Doesn't have quite the tactile feedback, but it feels better. But both will do the job. Nothing to really complain about that either. So let's put them to the side and let's actually already get to the next, I wouldn't say really less important part, but something that we should cover real quick, which are the ports. And there are definitely some differences, as I said already, just in terms of already digital outputs, because let's cover that real quick. On the CXA, we have 2 terminals because you can hook up 2 sets of speakers, A and B. Then we have here, this is for me the important one, the USB plug for the PC connection. Because of the DAC, that works really well. You should use the driver, because why not? You install it once and that's just the best thing you can do. Then we have two control bus inputs or connectors. Then USB Type A, which is pretty much just for their own Bluetooth dongle, which I think actually should have been already integrated in this device, because paying 100 extra just to get Bluetooth functionality, I think is a little bit steep, even though I wouldn't really use Bluetooth on something like that. Anyways, now here we have the coax, and here we have two optical digital inputs. Here we have a sub out, which the Azur doesn't even have, and 5 analog output inputs, along with the XLR if you want to use balanced. Now on the Azur, it looks a little bit different, because we also have the terminals, a little bit nicer quality. Here we have the RS232 connector. Then we have 2 times XLR, but also change for balanced or unbalanced for source 1 and 2. Then we have control bus once again, and at the bottom 8 analogs. Like I said, if you want digital inputs, you need something like this. In the case, what I used was the DAC Magic 100, which though doesn't really allow you to switch the sources, the digital ones, with a remote, because you have to use the button, and you need a second power adapter and a second cable. So it's definitely not quite as a convenient solution as having everything already in one device. But on the back you then see that you have the optical, 2 coax, and the USB port, along with obviously the output for the connections. The color is the same as the one on the Azur on the front, just not this, but this doesn't really matter. So like I said, you need to go through some extra hoops to get the same amount of functionality. But other than that, you are then on the same level. So remote controls, not a huge difference, but the other difference is actually the front. And I actually just noticed that this is the front. And let me actually plug these in real quick so you can see how they actually light up and what you will actually see. Because you maybe already noticed one thing. The Cambridge or the CXA doesn't have a proper display, because if we turn that on, all you will see is that the inputs light up. Obviously, you can turn off the lighting. And for example, here where we have Bluetooth, you can press the button once again, and then it changes to orange, which would be USB. All that is fine, but you don't really see the volume, which is actually an issue for me, because maybe you can see this little bit of a stripe. This is where it shows you the volume. Now, you see this maybe on the video, but you won't definitely see it wherever you are sitting and listening to music unless you have it super close. So this is a little bit of a complaint for me. What I would actually do if I would own it, I would maybe put a white sticker or something that just is a little bit visible, because so many times I turned it on and didn't know what the volume was. It was either way too loud or just way too low, but that's that. What we have here is a balance control. You can just put that out. Maybe you can see that, and then change the balance, and the same also works for the bass and the treble. But it's really fine tuning. You can't really adjust too much, because if you have a speaker that just doesn't have much bass, you can't turn it into something super bassy. It has its limitations, but it's for fine controls. If you just want to do some minute adjustments, it will work. Now on the Azur, things look a little bit nicer, I would say, because here we have a display. We have all the sources available, as you can see, and they actually even can be renamed. As you can see, for example, here I use PC, and I definitely think this is so much more handy, because if I change the volume, I see it actually, which is just as good. Now in the middle, what we have here is a direct button, not for balance. Balance can be changed a little bit in a different way, but otherwise the tone controls as well. There is also a difference here in terms of the headphone jack, because on the CXA it's just a 3.5mm, but therefore we get an input for coax or for aux, which we could use for hooking up to an MP3 player with a phone or something like that. We don't have that on the Azur, but therefore we get a 6.35mm jack. The headphone jack quality on the CXA actually isn't all that great. When I compared it to my headphone amps, I found that there was a little bit dynamic missing, especially with my monolith M1060s, sounded very muffled, and I didn't really like it so much. The Azur does a noticeably better job, but I think in most cases you will have a dedicated amp anyways. But this also, especially if you turn it off, has this nice little animation, and I just prefer to have a display, but that's just me. You have to know that on your own. So we've covered the features, so let's now actually get into the sound. And when I'm talking about the sound, we obviously have to mention just one thing. It will always depend on the speaker that you're using in the room that you're using them. So whatever I'm going to tell you here might sound still, after all, quite different in your case, because I've used them with 3 different pairs of speakers, like for example also the Aero Max 2 that I got with these here. And let me explain this. This one has 80 watts, hence the name. This one has 120 watts at 8 ohms. Both deliver way more than enough power, because I've compared them, for example, to an AV receiver that has way more watts, at least, yeah, what they tell you in terms of specs. But in stereo mode, these blow everything up to like at least $1,500 away, or 1,000 way away. Believe me, this sounds so much better than the Yamaha AV receiver that I have, even though it's super old. This is proper stereo power, 80 watts, and I could drive some proper big floor standing speakers on both without any ease. And I would say something like the Aeromax 2 that I reviewed, you could easily actually use just the CXA60. 20 watts less, no USB port, and a little bit of a different sound, which I can't judge, but it should be good enough. But that one is noticeably cheaper at around $750, but actually it should be, at least street price wise in Germany, it's around $660. Now, in case you want the USB DAC, you need at least a proper DAC actually again, which is done 100 more. So this, in terms of value, is actually really good. But how is the actual sound? Now, I would say, before I'm actually going into the differences between the two, they are both very neutral. They have both very nice details in the lower end, nice mids and highs, everything well articulated. And I don't really think like I'm missing too much. Actually nothing. I'm not quite sure why I even said it, because I wanted to go into something else, because I can't properly judge how this will sound. Because I said it, speaker and the way you position them will make a big impact on which one you will like more, especially with your speakers. Because what I've noticed when I compared them A/B, mostly the time with my double sevens, which are do-it-yourself speakers, I noticed one major difference when it comes not to the sound, because the sound signature is very, very similar, because they're very neutral, with a lot of details and a lot of resolution and all that, absolutely top. But it's the actual sound signature, because on the CXA I would explain it like this: you have the vocals obviously in the center, but a little bit wider than at least on the Azur, which is obviously very noticeable, and it spreads a little bit just wider. And therefore it just doesn't feel quite as mono, because what my speakers do is they kind of laser vocals that come from the center directly to you without spreading them too much. On the CXA, it was a little bit wider, and especially if I watch TV shows or just monologue or something like that, it didn't feel quite as narrow. But the sound signature or the sound stage therefore felt limited, at least as limited as the room was. Because when I closed my eyes in a room that is like a little bit over 3 meters wide, I definitely noticed the limits of the room. And this is where the Azur made a completely different soundstage. First of all, here we had this laser point imaging from the vocals, but very, very narrow. So where it was like this on the CXA, it was more like this on the Azur. But that has a big difference in terms of the overall soundstage, which kind of seemed to kind of blow away the outer limits of the room, and it was way wider than it actually was. At least that's how it sounded. So there was a way bigger differentiation between the vocals in the middle and the outsides. So everything was more structured, more layered, and there was just way more differentiation between. Now, if that's a good or a bad thing really depends on what kind of music you are listening to, and obviously what kind of speakers you're having. Because if you have speakers that already have quite wide vocals, it maybe won't be as audible on the Azur, but in my case it was very obvious. But if that's a good thing or a bad thing is also just depending on the music, because where it was amazing was orchestras or ballads where we have vocals and a very wide sound with a lot of instruments, and you can feel everything in between, which is super nice, because the music also was, in terms of tonality or in terms of structure, a little bit more foregrounded, where it was here kind of more balanced. But vocals stood out so well, and if you closed your eyes, you could just hear everything else so nice above. But the issue is that I didn't really enjoy metal or rock, at least that's not mixed up all that well with a good sound signature or sound stage, as much as maybe on this one in comparison, because it still sounded very good, because the amp and obviously the speakers can't really change if the music, or can't improve the sound if the music just isn't as good. And what I've noticed for metal, for example, you heard the very narrow vocals, and the soundstage just wasn't all that there, so it felt a little bit awkward. Now this is where I think the CXA80 actually makes a little bit of a better all-round job, because since you have a little bit of a wider range of vocals, a little bit of a less pinpointed line that goes towards you, but with a little bit of a narrow thing, it doesn't quite make such a difference if the music isn't that good. Because if you have bad music on the Azur, it's audible. And it can be a little bit off-putting. At least some certain bands, I just didn't really want to listen to them on this. On this one, it's way more acceptable because it maybe isn't quite as possible to hear, like everything differentiated as well, because there is also quite some difference in terms of power, what it has. But getting back to the sound signature, here you can just hear so much more in between what you can't hear here. But therefore, the range of kind of genres that you can listen with is actually wider, and maybe it's actually for maybe the better all-round solution, especially if you listen to a lot of music that just isn't mixed up that well. If you have high-end quality audiophile music and you mostly listen to that, I think you will be better off with the Azur. But if you want just generally listen to everything in all kind of different genres and also watch a lot of movies and TVs and want this little bit of a wider feeling in terms if you listen to voices and not just having everything very narrow, maybe this one is better. But where the Azur obviously has also some important advantages is just the power, because with 120 watts it just delivers you more in the lower regions in the bass. Because here it's not that you are really feeling the limits of the speaker already, but you just notice that there is more structure and more power, more dynamics behind it with the Azur, because the Azur feels even more so kind of mature and sovereign, if that's the proper word, just more confident when it gets to the bass. So you hear more detail and it sounds even more so tighter and way more precise than it does here, even though it already sounds very good here. The mids make a little bit less of a difference, but the upper mids and the especially highs with the vocal range is where they stand out more on the Azur. They are more better integrated if you want something like that, because it's something that I personally like a lot on headphones if the vocals stand out. And that's the reason why I would personally go for this after all, because you really have to find the proper thing for your speaker system, and I can't really tell you if the one that you are using works better with this or better with this, especially in the room, because there might be rooms that are maybe acoustically more challenging, where this one actually, since it's a little bit kind of more forgiving, might be the better chance. But if you have maybe the ideal room where things just work perfectly, this could play perfectly in that, but also maybe vice versa, so that's very hard to judge. I can just tell you what my speakers did, and I explained that to you, and in the end my decision was to go for this, even though this is the more expensive version with actually way less convenience, because I have to use a second power outlet, I have to use a second cable, a DAC cable, and I have to switch the sources manually. I can't just have everything integrated in here. But in the end, it was just the more audiophile sound, the little bit more precision, the sound stage that I actually kind of would have wanted here. But if you listen to the right music, which I have to agree or admit that the older I get, the more kind of more laid back music I listen to, which just sounded so much more impressive, at least with this sound stage where you felt so surrounded but could hear every little detail in between, which was not really muddled in here, but just not quite as layered. But for everyone who has a lower budget, or who just doesn't want to spend maybe 1,500 yet, or maybe just wants to have a nice mid-range stepping stone, unless he wants to get something really good, or just finds maybe something even better, this is actually a really nice solution. Because just think about it, €1,000, maybe sounds a lot too many, but for a real good stereo amplifier like this one, with an USB DAC, with all the connections that I would possibly want for, with a good remote control, with a really nice sound signature, and with enough power to drive everything, this sounds absolutely legit. And I totally get if people don't want to pay 500 more, because like I said, you need like this extra, you need to set up things different, but therefore you get, I mean, at least more convenience in terms of the display, because you have that and such. But it really comes down to what you want. Let me know in the comments which kind of you think sounds better for you, or maybe if you heard them too. I have to say, I would be actually fine with either one, but this just feels, after all, since it is the flagship, a step above, and the Edge series is a little bit above my pay grade. But this, for everyone, and actually let's kind of cover in what kind of price ranges should be in terms of speakers. Now, this is always something very subjective, because I know people that like to spend way more on the electronics than on their speakers, and I know people that do it completely other way around. Because I have to say, in the past, I rather spend more money in the speaker, which still have a bigger impact on the overall sound experience than just the amp, especially with the room and such. And I went more for cheaper electronics and a good speaker system. But if you put a proper speaker system with a proper amp in combination, it just might be the dream combo, maybe in your room, as you do some room optimizations. But I would say this one, everything up to $3,000, $4,000, maybe for some people even $5,000 a pair, should still be easily good enough. This, I would say, at least starting at $3,000, you should go for that, at least quality-wise, or go way up high. You could even drive something at around $10,000, even though I think most people then will get something more high-end. But this has room to grow with. Here, you are in a nice mid-range level, and you can kind of look into the upper mid-range with that without any issues. I really liked it. But for some reason, even though I would wish for a newer, updated version that has the inputs already integrated, that would be my dream combo, but that's just not possible. So I rather live with a little bit of a compromise, because the rest fits me better. And like I said, the price, $500 more, if you consider that over 5 or 10 or 15 years, that is actually not that much. The initial shock sounds much, like 50% more than this, but you have to see this on your own. So I'm done. I hope it was helpful. If it was, maybe a thumbs up, and hopefully then, in case that this works good, maybe some more reviews in the future. But other than that, I wish you a nice day. Until next time, bye.